Cuba's in a lot of trouble.
U.S. military could go into Cuba.
We'll see what happens, but we're freeing up Cuba.
Charging Raul Castro with conspiracy to kill U.S. nationals.
It is implicitly an amphibious assault. Well, a Southern Spear is a major effort. It involves a number of different countries now throughout there, and there's a tremendous amount of cooperation, and that does translate to what we see with somewhat of a unity of effort in making sure that Cuba doesn't evade the sanctions and basically this blockade in terms of what's going on there. So that is one of those things that's kind of come out of the Southern Spear military effort and the alignment with a number of other countries there. But one of the things that's been talked about a lot is that the U.S. military could go into Cuba. And certainly President Trump's rhetoric is such that it's been interpreted that he is alluding to U.S. military action in Cuba. There's been some discussion, would it look like a Maduro operation where they go in and try to take Raul Castro? I personally think that would be a very difficult operation to conduct at this point, simply because, first off, everybody in Cuba can look to what we just did in Venezuela and recognize, how we might try to do that. So that would be very, very difficult as well. Of course, part of setting the seeds for that was the criminal indictment against Raul Castro for murder, and that was tied to something that happened in the mid-'90s and back in 1996. So it does give a legal predicate for why we would want to get our hands on Raul Castro and bring him to the United States, in much the same way why we wanted to get Maduro and bring him to the United States to stand trial. But the other thought is, would we try to invade, overthrow the regime by force? And certainly rhetorically that's been talked about. It's possible. I have read some assessments where they say, within 48 to 72 hours, we could essentially neutralize their Navy and Air Force. We could pretty much gut their command, control, communications capability. Yes, we have all those capabilities. One thing, being 90 miles off the coast of the U.S., it's a tremendous threat, but it also makes for a tremendous ability to project power from the U.S. directly into Cuba because they're right there. So we literally could launch from the continental United States, certainly Key West, Florida, and some other bases and other places in southern Florida would be places where we could launch a tremendous amount of airstrikes and other things that could do that. The thing with Cuba, though, is it's a big country. Its regular military active duty at any given time isn't that large. It's only about 50,000, a little less than 50,000. It does have about somewhere around almost 40,000 reserves, organized reserves. But the thing with Cuba is it's got about 1 million people in its paramilitary forces. It's youth, labor, army, it's territorial militia. And this is a thing that really kind of concerns planners, is would they turn into this massive insurgent force that would be fighting us if we were to move into the country? And we know the geography. We fought there before. That was the Spanish-American War. Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Riders and all the stuff that happened. So we're very familiar with Cuba. We've got a military base down there. We're familiar with the terrain. We probably have looked at and analyzed Cuba more than I can, not more than every country in the world, but certainly we have analyzed it extensively. We understand the dynamics. We understand the challenges in terms of lines of communication, road systems, everything else that would be working down there. And also we recognize that mountainous country up to the north. Most of it's a plain, but there are significant mountains that run through parts of the country. And that's an area where that's where Castro was up in the hill country for a long time, and after Castro, there was a resistance to Castro's regime that the U.S. backed that was operating up there literally into the mid '60s, which kind of lost to history, but it was an active counter-regime, anti-communist force that was operating up there. So we recognize the challenges of trying to militarily go in and impose our will across Cuba, and that the Cuban people themselves have been basically subjected to this system through their entire educational process for generations now. So you have a mindset throughout the country that you didn't have in, say, in the early 60s. It's just Cubans are not the same Cubans they were back in the 60s. And so they would have fertile ground for recruitment of insurgents and those that could do all sorts of harm to our military forces where we try to do that. So there's a lot of reasons why this particular approach of using a blockade, sanctions, financial pressure, all sorts of things that we're doing is being pushed hard. We look at one thing that came out of the Venezuela playbook, if you will, was one key player. Maduro was gone, but once he was out of place and once we had demonstrated the capabilities that we had, rather than having to work to overthrow the entire regime, we had the regime basically come to terms with the U.S. And now the U.S. is very much involved with a variety of things down there. And I think that's the hope, is that we could eventually hit a point where the regime could change internally and come to some sort of accommodation where they would no longer pose a threat to U.S. or U.S. interests in the region, and then also open up the country so that more aid and support could go to the Cuban people. Well, going in to take Raul Castro is very intelligence intensive. It was very intelligence intensive down in Venezuela. I don't know what our human intelligence capabilities are on the ground in Cuba, because it's just a very challenging environment. Venezuela was a little bit more open. There was not the institutional cohesiveness in Venezuela that there is in Cuba. All elements of the regime work together. They have for a very, very long time. The president, Canal Diaz, basically controls all levers of power throughout the Cuban government and Cuban society. So very difficult to gather sort of detailed intelligence of wherever Raul Castro is. And you can bet wherever he is, it's not going to be something like you see with Maduro. I don't know if they're hiding him down in some deep underground bunker or something like that. But I would imagine wherever he is someplace that would be very, very difficult to get to him, where we would be experiencing a lot of resistance from whatever security forces are around him. And it could be these things are very, very difficult. One thing about special operations is that when they work, they look spectacular, and when they don't work, they can go really wrong in a big way very quickly. And I would point to the U.S. attempt to rescue our hostages in Iran, back in 1980. That went very, very wrong. And these things can happen. And then if you go back in history, a variety of things I can think of back in World War II, some of the things under Churchill, where they had some very spectacular special operations successes or raids. And then they had a couple that were really bad, that did not go well at all. And so those things can happen in any type of special operation. So there isn't, they're going to have to make a risk assessment to figure out, would this be operationally assured that they could pull something like that out. The other thing is, if we got Raul Castro, what changes would that cause within the regime? What changes would that cause in Cuban society? And that's a political estimate. That's a sociological estimate. Does it further what we're trying to do, or could it potentially set back what we're trying to accomplish? And so that's an assessment that they're going to have to make at the time as well. So those are all very difficult questions that have to be answered, that have to be addressed before any attempt to do something like that takes place. Now, if we were to go in there and militarily try to take Cuba, that's not so much a SEAL thing or a special operations thing. That's large military forces. Those are significant military units that would roll in. Obviously, because it's an island, it is implicitly a amphibious assault because where it's located. It also, any attempt to do something like that would immediately put our base in Guantanamo into harm's way. If we were even to attempt to do that, they could turn around as a reaction and attack our base in Guantanamo. And I don't know that we could really defend that base against a full, Cuban military onslaught onto the base. So there are a variety of different considerations that we have to have in terms of that. I think, based on what I'm seeing, I think the hope is that this pressure campaign will result in the regime engaging in a significant negotiation a deal, if you will. Cuba has represented a threat to the United States ever since since the revolution of 1959. They were obviously a springboard for pushing out communist revolutions throughout the Western Hemisphere. The days of Che Guevara and things back in the 60s. They helped push communist movements, anti-United States movements throughout Latin America. Had big success for a while in Nicaragua under Daniel Ortega. It basically became a communist country. They were having quite a bit of success in El Salvador for many, many years, and the U.S. was involved trying to help the government fight off the communists there. Eventually reaching a peace treaty in 92, but they were very much involved with communist actions all over the place, Colombia, Guatemala, Venezuela throughout. And then in more recent years, they had aligned themselves closely with Venezuela, with the Maduro regime specifically. And so they were always a concern about that. It was kind of a mercenary regime, if you will, for the Soviet Union, that they would send Cubans around the globe to do their stuff. Now, more recently, the threat from Cuba has been hosting intelligence sites for China and Russia, cyber issues, of course, Havana syndrome, that whatever that is, that directed energy type system that's been used to debilitate so many of our diplomats and around the world. That obviously was something that first was noticed in Havana, hence the name. And so they've been certainly in the area of hybrid warfare, espionage. They've been a major threat there. And then you get into more recent things, such as they may have 300 drones. It's been said they have 300 drones, which could attack our facilities, specifically looking at Guantanamo Bay, where we have a naval base in Cuba, and then Key West, Florida, where we have a variety of things, military base there, and a variety of military command stuff there. And other places, obviously reaching as far as potentially Miami. So they are a threat in that regard. And then the other threat that they pose is a complete collapse of the Cuban economy, which has kind of happened before, has led to these massive immigration movements where they basically rush to the sea and get on anything that'll float and try to make their way to the United States. And I was involved in those operations, helping the Cuban refugees back in the mid-90s. I've just seen how extensive that can be, and that puts a tremendous burden on the U.S., but also in retrospect, we realize that opened the door for a lot of, within that overall movement, there were a lot of folks that were definitely not the Cubans that we wanted in the U.S., whether they were tied to Cuban intelligence or whether they were tied to criminal activity. So there's a multi-layered number of reasons why we don't want Cuba doing that. And of course, then there's also the other threat, which is that they can be a base for other countries to put in things. And with the emergence of China becoming a genuine global power and trying to move into the Western Hemisphere and Chinese activities on Cuba, it's a big fear is that China will supplant what the Soviet Union used to be and maybe do something else. And of course, if you really want to project forward, what would we do if, and there's a lot of what would we do if there was another thing like a Cuban Missile Crisis. This is not 1962. It is a whole different, whole different thing. And with autonomous weapon systems, drones, other things, it's not just looking at the current threat, it's looking at what this could quickly evolve into.